Ukraine has long complained it's hamstrung by restrictions on the weapons supplied by Western allies, restrictions that blocked them from being used deep into Russian territory. Now Germany's chancellor has announced that his country, as well as Britain, France and the US, have lifted those restrictions. To talk us through what it all might mean, we're joined by the Times' defence editor, Larisa Brown. Larisa, hello.
Hello.
What's behind the announcement of these restrictions being lifted?
Well, it's a bit of a strange timing, really, because, from our perspective, we thought last year that these restrictions had been largely lifted. We had Joe Biden, the US president at the time, under intense pressure from the British government and others to loosen their restrictions around the use of Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles inside Russia, and the UK had been arguing that it wanted to use their long-range weapons, allow Ukraine to use their long-range weapons to hit targets inside Russia. But Biden was extremely nervous because he thought it might escalate tensions with Putin, and there was all these concerns about the threat of a nuclear war and Putin's nuclear, saber rattling. So then we had this moment where we're told that Biden had lifted those restrictions, that Britain and France and the America could now use those weapons inside Russia, and it was a bit unclear at the time exactly where they could be used. So we knew that at least one Storm Shadow missile was used in the Kursk region, and there was a suggestion that others have been used nearby too. But there was never sort of confirmation that the long-range weapons could be used anywhere inside Russia, and I think that's what then we heard yesterday from the German chancellor. He sort of unexpectedly announced that all these weapons could be used wherever inside Russia, so into much deeper territory. But of course, he sort of left us wondering whether that means Germany's going to then send its Taurus cruise missiles, which have a lot longer range than the British and the French missiles, whether he's going to allow a shipment of those to go to Ukraine anytime soon. And it seems that it's still a little bit unclear when and if that is going to happen.
Friedrich Merz, there are a few reports that he may be meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky in Berlin tomorrow, Wednesday. Will they just be talking about those Taurus missiles? Merz hasn't been drawn on whether they'll hand them over. And also, how much could they change the prospects for Ukraine?
It's got to be at the top of the list for the Ukrainians, because they've been arguing for months, in fact years, that they need those missiles, because Germany's got a significant stockpile of them, several hundred of these Taurus missiles, whereas Britain and the French don't have as big a supply of their own long-range weapons. So the German ones are crucial, and Zelensky has always been arguing that they need to have those. And so of course, if this meeting is happening, it goes ahead, then Zelensky's going to want to be really clear that is a critical priority for Ukraine as it's continuing to be on the back foot in the war in Ukraine. The Russians are still advancing, they're grinding forward, but they are still advancing all of the time, and that's going to be extremely worrying for him. And of course, Germany is going to want to now be seen to be helping. There is a change in government, and they do have a different mindset, a different perspective on all of this than the predecessors.
How has Moscow, how has the Kremlin reacted to this announcement by Merz?
The Kremlin responded quite swiftly. I mean, they're not happy. I think they said something about, this threatens to escalate tensions, as you would expect. And just to go back as well to your previous question, you were saying, what could be the impact of these missiles? Now, the point is that the Russians have obviously moved a lot of their key bases, their logistics hubs, fuel depots back away from the front line, from those areas that Ukraine can target. So if they've got the Taurus missiles that can reach targets from as far as 300 miles away, then they're going to be able to hit some of those crucial key targets with these precision weapons. And so it could have an impact on those supply lines reaching the Russians at the front, on the front line inside Ukraine. And by cutting off their ability to get fuel or weapons or ammunition, that could really help the Ukrainians on the front line.
You've talked with us a lot over the past 3 years about Russia's red lines, these restrictions that have then been taken away, and some have called them, a bluff, red lines that don't exist. Do we think with this latest move, Vladimir Putin will keep blinking? He will just see this red line being crossed and do nothing?
I think there's been a lot of red lines that the West has seemingly crossed, and he hasn't responded with nuclear weapons, for example. I don't think he wants a nuclear war. We did have that situation in 2022 when the West really thought that Putin might use tactical nukes on Ukraine, and actually the West then basically threatened Putin and suggested that they would use conventional force in response, and so he obviously backed down. And I think if a lot of the experts that I speak to, military chiefs, former spy chiefs, people that have been really involved in all of this, just think that Putin is bluffing, and that unfortunately successive governments and especially Biden really believed him and took his sort of threats too seriously and prevented their countries from giving Ukraine the weapons that it actually needs to fight this war. And I think now you're starting to see a situation where Ukraine has, all these rules have been relaxed. We've obviously had these comments this week about relaxing the rules on long-range weapons, but some Ukrainians might argue, well, you're always doing these things, but they're coming too late. And actually, our stockpile of the Storm Shadow, for example, they've probably not got many of these weapons left. And this could, would have been much more useful if this had happened, over a year ago. And instead, we're still talking about this now. And also, don't forget that this was a rule restrictions that was decided upon by Western nations. There didn't need to be any taboo around this at all. We could have just gifted Ukraine the weapons and said, do whatever you want with them, because once we've gifted them, it's out of our hands. But instead we restricted their use, which I think a lot of people will look back on and think that actually this was kind of nonsensical, really.
Is all of this perhaps tacit acknowledgement from allies that peace is further away than ever?
I think that generally people don't see peace coming anytime soon. It's clear that Putin was given this chance by Trump to make a deal. It's obviously not going to happen as many people in Europe thought. No one actually expected, apart from perhaps Trump and his administration, no one expected Putin to actually suddenly end the war, because of course he could have ended the war. He could have never started the war, and then obviously he could have ended it at any point. And so I think there is this recognition that this is going to just rumble on, and Europe needs to do something to help Ukraine to really get on the front foot again and be able to push the Russians out, because that is not happening at the moment on the ground.
And as that rumbles on, you've been reporting on some of the Ukrainian soldiers and conscripts who are being trained here in Britain. Larisa, could you tell me about Operation Interflex?
Yes, this was really fascinating. I've been writing about Britain training Ukrainians for quite a while, but I've never actually gone to see it for myself. And this is the UK mission to train Ukrainians inside the UK. Now, don't forget, when Russian troops were lining up at the border of Ukraine in 2021 and 2022, the UK actually removed its troops from Ukraine and stopped their training mission out there, which was called Operation Orbital. And then they started training the Ukrainians in the UK, and this has been happening at different bases. The Ukrainians fly in and they are given anything from basic training for civilians that have just suddenly, come out from working at their flower shop and are now being trained to be battle ready to be sent back to Ukraine's front lines, and also training more senior Ukrainians in things that they don't have the time to be trained in Ukraine and don't have the facilities, and that's things like medical care and other I suppose battle techniques and strategies that the UK might focus on over here. And the Ukrainians that I was chatting to at this base were, they were really fascinating, a whole host of different people. Quite a lot of them had actually a lot of battle experience, and obviously I was sort of asking, well, you've been on the front line for several years, what can the British teach you? But they were all pretty, pretty optimistic, pretty resilient. They were saying that the UK does have a lot that they can learn, and one of the things for them, it was also being able to, the UK has a lot of things they can teach, and obviously being here away from all the shelling and the air raid sirens was, a breath of fresh air, and it gave them a chance to actually learn skills in silence, I suppose. They also did quite a lot of interesting stuff to make it seem like it is a war zone. So when they're out on the wheat fields, it was in this base, it was lots of wheat fields and trees. They were playing sort of the sound of bombing. They often put animal organs from the local slaughterhouse on the fences to make them feel like they're in a war zone, and obviously trying to replicate, human flesh, which is pretty grim. And they have actors that are brought in, including amputees. So it's all very realistic, and it gives them a chance to feel like they're over there, but actually then step away from that scene and learn the skills that they need to be able to fight better when they go back to Ukraine.
Do we know how this training compares to what Russian transcripts get?
They were saying here they're doing 5 weeks of training, which is a really condensed course. Normally the UK would do that basic infantry course in 6 months. And compared to the Russians, they were saying that the Russians do it all in just 10 days, so they get barely anything. And I think that kind of speaks to generally the treatment of Russian soldiers who are just being sent to Ukraine in huge numbers without the proper training or equipment. And actually one of the Ukrainians was telling me how when they come across the Russians, injured Russians, instead of being taken away for medical training by the Russians, they're just shot in the head by the Russians. So they have a very different treatment of their wounded on the battlefield.
Even in that very compressed training, the Ukrainian soldiers and the British and international trainers must develop a bit of a bond. How do the trainers feel when these troops then go back to Ukraine and without the trainers?
I think they find it really hard because they spend 5 weeks with these people, and then they obviously develop, a friendship with them, a rapport with them, and then they're on their way to the front line. And obviously the British soldiers realise that some of them, will die on the front line. That's just the reality of the war at the moment. And what they do is they do give them a proper farewell. They all stand and line the road as they go out on the coaches and salute them. And one of the officers was telling me that he believed that some of those British soldiers really wish they were actually going with them to fight this war. And in reality, the Ukrainian troops that are going back to Ukraine are fighting a war for Britain, because it's Ukraine that is having to defend itself against Russia. But if Russia was able to take Ukraine, obviously a lot of people in the West fear that would mean Putin sending his troops onto the rest of Europe and potentially attacking the UK. So there really was a sense that Ukraine is doing the fighting for them.